Okay. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. We really appreciate it. And thank you to Jaya. I'm really glad that you got to join me again today. I interviewed Jaya a few months ago for Aussie.com, and I'm excited to chat with you again about Molekule.
Yeah.
So Jaya, let's start with your background. You grew up in Gainesville, Florida, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what your childhood was like?
Yeah, and of course, thanks to Startup Grind for having me. Yeah, Gainesville, rewinding back in history in my memory, it was interesting. Gainesville, Florida is kind of like Palo Alto in that it's a very college-centric town. So growing up there, my father was a professor at the university, and it was really cool because, I mean, almost everything in the ecosystem of Gainesville revolved around that university. And so we got to see, my brother, myself, my brother who's also my co-founder, got to see a lot of innovations happening at an early stage. As we were growing up, we got to go to different professors' labs and see what science they were working on, the problems that they were tackling. And a lot of times these were things that people hadn't really started understanding that would be problems of the future, but they had identified and started working on. So we got to see innovation really early on. I think it was probably one of the most foundational things for me is to see how science happens, how technology is developed, and be at the heartbeat of that, talk to different professors, and be in this community that was just absorbed with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you did eventually come to Palo Alto, right, to Stanford?
I did,
Yep.
yes.
And you joined Change Labs, right, where the goal is to kind of create tools for tackling these global challenges.
Yeah.
Is that where you first were inspired to start Molekule?
So Molekule's story is kind of interesting in that it was actually, so going kind of back to Gainesville, my dad started working on an air purification technology way back when. I mean, I was still, I was probably, I think, 10 or 15 when he had started working on the technology. And he had only really begun looking at the space because my brother suffered from severe asthma and allergies. Yeah. And so as a scientist and as a professor, his big question was, well, like, why are we not cleaning the air better? Because that's probably what's causing the leaks problems the most. Right. And so he started working on the technology aside from me, and I wasn't even involved, and actually didn't care to get involved. Like, I was a kid, I was doing my own thing. Yeah. But fast forward several years later, I was here at Change Labs working on, so my father was working on this technology. I was here at Change Labs working on how can you look at really complex systems transformation. So Change Labs was all about taking this philosophy that was born out of Palo Alto of design thinking and saying, how can we evolve that to solve, not just bring out products and services, but actually create really life-altering systems change. So that was where my focus was at, and I happened to just stumble onto this air purification space that my dad was working on in a unique way. But yeah, it was ancillary to how Molekule was founded. It just happened to be that while I was working on Change Labs, I started looking at how do you take really complex systems and try to intervene and change the system entirely. Whether that be air pollution, whether that be the water crisis, but like the problem has to be big in nature, complex, and how do you go and tackle that? So that's where my interest got piqued in air purification, but it wasn't the original inspiration.
Right, and I'd love to hear more about that inspiration as well. But so the air purification business seems like a really challenging space to be in. Can you tell us a little bit about the industry and then talk about Molekule's approach and how your technology is different?
Yeah, so for context for everybody here, air purifiers typically rely on a really standard technology. It's called the Hepa filter. And the Hepa filter was invented way back in the 1940s as a part of the Manhattan Project. So its original purpose was actually to filter out radioactive dust.
Oh my God.
So, and this is the technology that we're using today. It hasn't evolved past that. So my father started looking at the space and saying, like, this doesn't sound right. I think you have to do something much bigger. And one of the big problems of a Hepa filter is that the extremely microscopic stuff, the stuff that we're seeing concentrate indoors, the chemicals, the really ultrafine particles, those escape a HEPA filter altogether.
Right.
And then big stuff like mold and bacteria, they grow and gather on those fibers and then get back into the air. So his approach to the problem as a scientist is, well, how can we just get rid of all of this stuff altogether? And so that's what's at the heart of our technology, is that instead of trying to just filter the air, we actually destroy pollutants at the most microscopic level. That was the technology that my father had spent years working on. Going back to how I got interested because this industry hadn't seen that kind of disruption. Yeah. And yet, here we were hearing reports about China, India, and even in the US, this awareness about, hey, air quality matters. It affects us at a really fundamental level. And there needs to be something that comes and addresses this problem. And the industry out there is just, frankly, not even thinking about evolving past this decades-old technology.
Yeah. Has it been really challenging to go up against an industry that hasn't been innovated on since the 1940s?
I think it's challenging to do a startup in general.
Yeah.
It's challenging to take a technology to market. I think the bigger challenge for us, because for me, that was just a reference point. The industry hasn't innovated.
Right.
The bigger challenge is, how do you take this laboratory science that has been, it was 20 years in the making, many collaborators. I think my father had taken funding from the DoD and the EPA in its early days at the university level. So there was a lot that had gone into it. But how do you take that technology out of a lab and actually commercialize it and make it a technology that's life-changing? After that, if it truly is life-changing, the technology should speak for itself.
Right.
If the industry has an answer, then great, but I don't think that they do.
Right. And to that point, I'd love to talk a little bit about fundraising. I think we all know it's tough to raise money as a woman in Silicon Valley, even more so as a woman of color. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience raising money and some of the tough situations you had to go through?
Yeah, raising money is just, it's interesting because on the one hand, you're challenged by the fact that, nowadays there tends to be just a very limited number of investors who are looking at hardware startups and then within that groundbreaking scientific innovation. But then, yeah, I think that nowadays you're starting to see a conversation around diversity of investment. I started reading some stats about, the percentage of female founders that make it, and that was shocking, but it wasn't so shocking because I had come from, and my degree is in engineering. That's what I came to Stanford to do. And when I graduated from University of Florida in my class of mechanical engineers, I was one of 5 women.
Right.
So I was used to the landscape, but obviously not happy with it. Fundraising, luckily for us, ended up boiling down to who would really get on board with the idea. But, I've seen and experienced everything. I was 8 months pregnant when we went and fundraised on our last funding round.
Yeah.
So everything from getting a contraction in a pitch meeting to investor to, going and having just an awesome connection and saying look, yeah, we get it, you get it. One of our investors actually funded us. It was on a Sunday. It was our seed investment. It was many years ago, and we came in on a Sunday, and he said, my best investments, Eric Chin, my best investments happen on Sundays. And he's been saying that's proved itself worlds over.
Yeah,
so.
That's great. Do you feel like it's going to get easier in the future? We keep talking about, innovating and making it easier for women to fundraise and changing the numbers. Do you think it actually will change in the future? Can a woman walk in 8 months pregnant and be confident that she's going to get money for her company?
I hope that as people start seeing more examples of female-funded companies perform really well when you look at the stats. And you go, girl.
Yeah, I
know. They perform really well, and so I think people will see that. One thing I've noticed is that for a long time, investors would look for this framework of a founder that looked like a Mark Zuckerberg or looked like a other
Musk,
great CEO. But the problem is that yes, they built their companies, but companies are going to come out of all sorts of different, areas in the country. In fact, part of coming out of Florida that was really fascinating for me is that I felt like I got to get this vantage point that wasn't within the Silicon Valley bubble.
Right.
And so people would tell us, really odd things for me to hear, and now I, see where they're coming from, but it doesn't make sense. They're like, well, why would anybody care about, the air they breathe? And I would just sit back in the meeting and be like, well, they may not be educated about the air they're breathing, but if you're asking, do people care about their health?
Yeah.
I know very well, coming from Florida, talking to everyday people, that they do, and this stuff matters to them. And when that starts happening, we're going to start seeing a whole different type of innovation, and that's what I'm really excited about. But for me, I think at this point, it's the most important thing is to just become a good example, because I wish that there were more people I could look up to and say like, oh, that's what I want to become.
Right. And luckily you have been able to raise money and grow at a pretty fast pace. I think it was in 1 year you went from 11 to 80 employees, something like that. Yeah. What was that period of rapid growth like for you? Yeah,
so in 2017, near the mid-2017, we had launched our product. And by end of 2018, we had crossed over 80. We were getting close to 100, and now we're over 100. Yeah. So it was intense. I mean, for us, I think we had done, before we had launched our product, and again, we're a hardware company, so it's not as easy as software to be able to test and tell if you're gonna be at this really sticky point. So it's really hard to forecast success. Yeah. But we had given our product out to a number of beta testers at that point. It was just literally at that time. It wasn't this beautiful device sitting next to me. Yeah. It was like an ugly black box. And we had just given it to say like, hey, look, does the core technology actually deliver value for people? Mm-hmm. And we started seeing this amazing, voice back from that community saying like, yes, it works, it's amazing. I mean, I had a mother crying saying, you've given my son his childhood back. Mm-hmm. I had somebody call me and tell us that like, I've been able to breathe through my nose for the first time in 15 years. Wow. So we had this inkling that this was gonna be something really big. Yeah. Did we know right out the gate that, we were gonna end up selling out, 7 times, get on Time's, top 25 inventions list of the year? Like, we didn't know any of that, but we had a lot of confidence. And so we went in with a lot of intentionality. We went in saying like, look, we know what kind of company we want to build. We know that, science needs the proper ecosystem to grow. And so in order to do that, this is what we have to build. So that growth just ended up being reflective of, the leaders we were hiring. Do they represent our values? Do they represent the ethos of what we want to create in the company? And then everything kind of came from there. Right, exactly.
And yeah, I'd love to talk more about the problem that Molekule is trying to solve. We're experiencing climate change right now. Air pollution is worsening. The fires here in the Bay Area and Southern California were absolutely devastating, causing some of the worst air quality we've seen in US history. If we don't see regulation that tackles these issues, at what point do you think brands and consumers have a responsibility to create change?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned regulation, because my background at Stanford, I did a master's in mechanical engineering, but also public policy. So really? I had originally gone out into the world thinking I would would try to bring about the world that I wanted to see in the world through the realm of policy, right. And ended up going into startups, which I swore to people, I said I'm never going to do a startup. I'm doing a startup now. So it was interesting because I definitely think that there is a place for comprehensive policy reform. That being said, it has to be met with innovative startups and companies that have answers to these problems. And so this goes back into my belief in how investors are investing and where I feel like investment needs to happen, probably to a greater degree, but like we need more companies that are going to solve these challenges and be hubs of innovation. Yeah. For us, it's the air pollution problem that consumes our mind, because the consequence of climate change is that both our environment and our health is going to see massive consequences.
Right.
And so, you know, we obsess over that, and we think about how do we build that company. And more than that, like the people who buy molecules today, they're the ones telling us that, like, look, we want to, like, they're saying, like, look, I wish this was in my hospital. I wish this was in, you know, the plane that I fly in, because, you know, what am I breathing in those moments? Yeah. and all these other different environments. Like, what about my office building that, you know, people often confuse the fact that they're getting tired or sleepy or, you know, exhausted at work with the fact that something's wrong with them. It might actually be, and likely is, your environment and the chemicals in the air. And so we want to make sure that we provide a response to that. And I think consumers are the first step in creating that wave and that movement, because now we're seeing big brands come up to us. Intercontinental came to us recently, and now we're working with them in San Francisco. They came to us because they saw it. They saw a molecule, and they're like, "Look, we need this in our hotels, and we know that our consumers are going to feel better after they use it."
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Knowing what you know now, if you could go back in time and give some advice to your younger self as an emerging entrepreneur, what advice would you give? And is there any advice you've received that you disagree with?
I think one thing I have learned over this time frame is that there, you know, you hear these stories of, you know, Edison invented the light bulb, Nikola Tesla did all of this. Like, you hear these stories of groundbreaking technology come into the world, and often on the surface you just see this, like, this upward curve to success.
Right.
And in fact, it's a bumpy road, and it is full of challenges and is full of tough choices every single day. And so I think reminding myself that, you know, having doubt about your decisions is actually a good thing. It means you're questioning what you're doing. It means that you're looking at the decision critically. I've seen a lot of other founders who feel like it's necessary to show confidence, whereas I've actually found that sometimes lack of confidence is your ally.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, and so that's one of the things that, like, I think we tend to project something because we believe it's, you know, it's important, but we make it super clear to our teams, like, look, I don't have all the answers.
Right.
I don't want to, and if I'm wrong or if you feel differently, I want you to call me out on it so that we can foster more ideas and get to our end goal faster, because we all agree that we want to solve this problem.
Right, exactly. And backstage, we were briefly talking about the future, you know, like not just 10 years, but 50, 100 years in the future. What do you think air purification will be like that far in the future? And what is Molekule working on now that's going to get us there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we look at air purification completely holistically. Today, we're addressing the problem of air pollutants in the air. That's things like, you know, chemicals, mold, bacteria, airborne infectious diseases like, you know, different viruses and bacteria, mold, all these things. But we look at air as a complete solution. So, you know, we'll be looking into things like carbon sequestration, CO2 capture, all of these different vantage points of how can you make the air you breathe completely holistically clean. And the way that we get there is by creating a foundational scientific company. And so for us, at least, it's really important that as we're creating the company, we're laying the foundation for how do you actually incubate scientific innovation. I mean, it took my dad and his team 20 years to get to where they got to, but I definitely believe that if you look at the landscape out there, what's happening with our environment, what's happening with health, we don't have the affordance of time. And so this whole environment of, you know, cutthroat, competitive, you know, let the best rise is not our approach. Our belief is that you create a highly collaborative environment that allows people to, allows a lot of diversity of thought. And in that process, you're gonna see the best ideas rise, because we want to accelerate the pace of innovation. So So just an example, my dad did 20 years to get to where we got to when we started commercializing Pico.
Right.
The technology we launched is, now is 35% better than what it was when we launched, which was a year and a half ago. And then what we have in the lab is now 3x of where we're at. And that happened in the span of 6 months.
Right.
So our pace is increasing. So the proof is in the pudding. Those values are translating to business value.
Yeah, but it takes a good foundation to be able to work that fast.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you started the company with your father and brother, right? What has that been like working with family on a startup?
Yeah. It makes for an interesting family dinner.
Yeah.
No, like, in all seriousness, we keep things really professional. We have an org chart. We manage through that. Like, look, you have your areas of ownership. I have my areas of ownership. I mean, the only kind of unique thing about the situation we came out of is that, Dilip was the earliest guinea pig of my dad's prototype.
Right,
so
right.
like we got to see that, and we had the vantage point of seeing a technology from its foundation. So I feel like we have some, like, we hold back to the integrity of what was started. I think sometimes people can lose their way, but we have that historical knowledge, and that's what we bring to the table.
Right, definitely. So I always like to ask founders this, you're very immersed in the industry of science and technology. What is one area of emerging tech that you think is underrated right now that's going to be really important in the next couple of years?
Yeah, and I'm going to try not to be self-serving in this.
Yeah.
Because I do think that, what we're seeing with the global air pollution crisis and, the over billion people who are suffering from some form of respiratory illness that are impacted by that immediately, and then even beyond that, everybody who breathes, is really important. But generally, just looking at what's happening with the environment and knowing what is coming with climate change, I think we tend to, in the Valley, often over-index for, what is the next SaaS startup that's gonna, revolutionize my, pet shopping experience. And I'm joking, but it tends to be a focus. But I think where you'll see a ton of innovation coming out is, and consumers will look for, are companies that answer that question of the environment.
Right.
And it's not secondary to their mission, it's their primary focus.
Right. Jaya, thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely.